Times and Sunday Times and author, and also deputy leader writer for The Sun. Olivia Hadley, thank you both very much for coming in on a Saturday evening. You've chosen to kick off with The Mirror. Its front page, it's war on the virus. It feels very much like everything has stepped up a little notch for the papers today.
Yes, and I think sort of late at the end of last week, we were sort of just beginning to grasp how serious this is. And now this weekend, I think we're all beginning to grasp just how long this is going to be going on for. And I think there's a detail here in the Mirror and in the Express as well, that over 70s could be asked to self-isolate for 4 months. And I think that kind of explains why earlier in the week, a lot of people were criticising the government for not acting dramatically, not introducing these draconian measures that other countries were introducing quickly. But I think now when we see that they thought timing was very important, because if they're going to be locking old people up, essentially, they don't want to be doing it for longer than they need to be doing it for. And now I think we can kind of see why. If it might be 4 months, well, let's not make it 4.5 months or 5 months, because every week that essentially, they don't want to be doing it for longer than they need to be doing it for. And now I think we can kind of see why. If it might be 4 months, well, let's not make it 4.5 months or 5 months, because every week that over 70s are home alone will be very lonely and difficult to get through.
But it raises all sorts of questions, doesn't it, Matthew, about the logistics of looking after people if they are self-isolating. It's one thing if they're a couple, but if they're on their own, it's really miserable.
It's exceptionally difficult. I mean, whenever you think of any given policy and the logic of it, and then you begin to think of the unintended consequences, what it might mean in practice, you begin to see that almost any aspect of what is already a multidimensional public problem has many sub-dimensions. I went down to visit my beloved father today, don't know if he's watching, with my 2 children, and we were worried about going to see him. Obviously, there's no bar on that at the moment. The government says it's not that you can't do it, but we were conscious of the risk that Teddy and Evie had been at school during the week. It's possible they'd picked something up. We were worried that they might transmit something to Dad, who's quite frail and has pre-existing health conditions and is in his late 70s. And he said, no, I want to see them. If there is going to be a long period of isolation, I want to see the kids. I'm prepared to take the risk. But then I thought, if we do allow Dad to take the risk and then he becomes ill, he could be taking another bed, which might be needed by somebody else. Why would you want to take the risk with somebody? That's what's really difficult here. There are so many trade-offs and conflicts that we as individuals, the community, but also the government are having to read and adapt to day by day. It's a horrible and difficult situation.
Yeah, I mean, one of those trade-offs which is quite interesting is that there's a theory that the government is keeping schools open and might, in fact, introduce measures to stop teachers closing schools.
That's right.
Because they actually would like schools to be open because kids aren't too badly affected by this. So part of the herd immunity plan, this theory goes, is that you get as many kids infected as possible. They pass it on to other healthy people who aren't in high-risk groups, and then the population becomes immune. But as you say, what are the unintended consequences of that? That's assuming that kids aren't then going to stay with their grandparents at the weekend.
Right.
You can't possibly know. So just so many spinning plates all the time.
Also teachers, you're assuming that teachers
don't have underlying health conditions. Exactly.
Or that the people that they live with don't. And
the thing that is interesting, people say that the most persuasive people are the ones with very strong views, who sound incredibly confident and decisive. I found those particularly unconvincing in the last week or so. I saw somebody on Question Time absolutely adamant, we have to do it this way. And they're lunatic. Rory Stewart, I think, retweeted somebody who described government policy as lunacy, as if it's just obviously wrong. I find that deeply unconvincing. Those who say we have to shut it down now, what about if the virus comes back and then spikes and you have to shut down the country and the economy for months and years? And then, of course, on the other side, well, herd immunity is clearly a sensible, wise, long-term strategy. But what if that immunity doesn't exist, that you get the virus and you may still be susceptible? I've looked at some of the modelling of the epidemiologists, and very tiny adjustments in the parameters in this curve make massive downstream differences. And I want to say, I just don't envy the chief scientific officer or the chief medical officer who are having to make very difficult judgments and will get criticised whatever happens. I even don't envy Boris Johnson, who is relying on his best scientific opinion. If it doesn't work out quite as well as it could, people question his motives. And if he had rejected the scientific advice,
then
imagine what that would have been. But Johnson says we don't want any expertise when it comes to people's health.
I think what's particularly sort of, well, brave or maybe stupid, depending on how things turn out, is obviously there's no kind of obvious, there's nothing that looks like a win for Boris Johnson now. I can't really imagine the scenario where everyone goes, well done, Boris, you've handled this really well, apart from perhaps maybe in a year's time, our second outbreak is less bad than other European countries' second outbreak of coronavirus. But that's not a kind of quick win for him. And if in the next few weeks more people die, as looks quite likely, and if in other European countries where there are more draconian measures, fewer people are dying, then that just looks incredibly bad. So in a way, it seems quite brave to be taking this very different path, where I just can't see how it can look like it's going right.
But also, of course, it depends on the time period, because it may well be that the UK has more proportionate number of deaths in the short term,
exactly,
but less in the medium term. So that calculation is very... I mean, I don't know if you did that. I phoned a few of the most strenuous experts who were opposing the government's line in the week, just to tease out their assumptions. When you really push them, there's deep uncertainty. You know, they may not express it, because there are incentives here too. If you're a doctor and you want to make a name for yourself, you're not going to get on television or in the press if you say it might be a good view. I'm not entirely sure, but if you say it's absolute madness, you're more likely to make noise. That gets retweeted. And so I think one has to, and you know, Rory Stewart as a mayoral candidate, you know, 10 to 1 against, you know, he wants to get it, you know, he's much more likely to be apocalyptic in his assessment of government policy. I think one needs to take that into account.
And he's got no responsibilities as well.
Exactly.
No one's holding him to account.
The problem is, if we look at our approach and you compare it to the approach of different countries, we don't know how successful or unsuccessful those countries are. There isn't really a really clear set of data from any country as to people who have got it and recovered, people who might not even know they've had it. We don't know here in the UK how many people have had it. It could have been here for months and we just don't know. And so there are all these unknowns. It's impossible to say who is doing better than
And I think it's a bit too easy to say that the countries where, you know, places like Italy or Wuhan, where everyone got locked down, to then say that those countries are dealing with it well. Well, surely the test of whether they're dealing with it well is when people come out of that lockdown, and then to see whether they get it again. Because it's not sustainable, obviously, just to have a country not operating at all. That's not really dealing with it well.
I think that's a really, really important point, because you get this a lot on. So I don't know if you are on the social. But you are on the social. I mean, I don't know how serious. Yes, sadly, it's one of the scourges of modern life. Yeah, I am. Yeah, you have to as a journalist. But that thing about China doing incredibly well. I mean, if you look at the graph of the number of new cases, it's going right down. But as the chief scientific officer said in the press conference at number 10, you try and suppress it, it may come back at the worst time. We just don't know.
Let's look at another paper, because we're meant to be reviewing the papers rather than just chatting. The Sunday Telegraph. The Prime Minister's putting industry on war footing to equip the NHS for the battle ahead. Different takes on there on the main headline for tomorrow, but this is obviously a major thing, that the factories that make respirators are being urged to press ahead and make as many as they can.
Yes, that's right. And I think that's got to be a wise approach. You want to, at this point, given the unprecedented nature of what this means, you want to start thinking about all of the coalitions you can create with private industry to make ventilators. You may want to nationalize airlines and rail companies. I think there's probably a whole range of measures that are being mooted at the moment behind closed doors in Downing Street. There'll be a raft of measures coming down the line. Because it seems to me, however many uncertainties there are, this is going to be a long-term issue. This virus will be a long-term issue. If it mutates, or some other mutation comes along with similar properties, or even more lethal properties, we're going to need... one silver lining may be that we will create a genuine multilateral approach for the next mutation, so that we can shut it down as soon as it emerges. It can't escape, right? That it seems to me, is a way to do it with some kind of a global plan, insurance to make that happen. I mean, that's a pretty elusive silver lining, probably, because we seem to be losing the talent as a species for multilateral action.
The Telegraph at the side there, it says families soon told to self-isolate together there if one falls ill. And this is a concern for a lot of people because a lot of people are saying, well, you know, I've got these symptoms. I live in a one-bedroom flat with my family. How on earth can I self-isolate away from them? So what happens if you are with the symptoms and you have to stay at home?
Well, that's the thing.
How
I
long
mean,
do you get it?
I don't know who in London could manage to, you know, there's advice saying you should sleep alone. Well, if everyone I know my age lives in one-bedroom flats with their partners. How could you possibly spend? Or particularly lots of people in big blocks with lots of people. I just don't really understand how self-isolation is supposed to work in places in big cities. And also, I was reading an interesting comment in the Sunday Times comment section about someone who was saying him and his wife have symptoms, but their 4-year-old doesn't, and the 4-year-old doesn't really understand the rules of self-isolation, and it's quite difficult and can't look after himself. But you know, are they allowed to go near their child or not? Because that's surely quite a big. I think this families isolating together makes a lot of sense. Because don't we know how parents could cope otherwise?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and that's one of the other things. I mean, you've been running on your headlines tonight about the letters coming in from scientists critiquing. There's also behavioural scientists who are critiquing the idea that the British public will be fatigued by certain measures. There seems to be, right in the early stages, there was a lot of consensus politically. Scientifically, there's clearly a huge amount of fragmentation.
Although the letter that has been released in the papers for tomorrow with all these signatories, a lot of it, they're all academics, but a very, very small number of them are actually epidemiologists, virologists.
Right. The scientists, is that right?
Yeah, a lot of them are mathematicians. So although they are
modelers,
well-educated and academic people, perhaps not as experienced in that specific field as others may be. We've got loads more to talk about, but we're going to go to the break, and we'll be looking much more at the rest of the inside pages, plus the British heavyweight boxer Tyson Fury facing an unlikely opponent. We'll talk about that next. What is that? Is that a pin? Welcome back. You're watching the press preview with me now, the Times and Sunday Times columnist Matthew Syed and Olivia Utley, deputy leader writer for The Sun. Panic buying, it's on the inside pages of the papers and it's been going on for a few days, but the Mail has it on page 8. Sainsbury's shelves stripped by 7 a.m. It says Tesco also looking like a riot zone. I don't think we can bring them up on the screen. That's a pity.
Have you seen panic buying? I mean, I can only speak about what I have seen, and in my sort of neighbourhood in southwest London, I haven't seen anything like that. In fact, interestingly, I found most human interaction not that dissimilar to what it would be on any normal day. The only significant difference, obviously, is handshaking. People are not shaking hands. You can see people on the tubes. I've been on the tubes this week using hand sanitizer, things like that. I suspect, I think one time, I don't want to sound gloomy, but I think when 2 or 3 people die who are a bit younger and who don't have pre-existing health conditions, that's possible, right? Then it might start to change the way people think. More anxiety, some slight, subtle but decisive change in the social fabric. I do worry about that a bit, but I haven't seen that yet.
There are a lot of people posting stuff online of themselves with their big stockpiles in their cupboards and stuff, and you sort of think, why would you do that? What's the mentality behind that?
I know, because it doesn't reflect very well on the person who's, you know, we've heard so many times, don't empty the shelves. We're all going to need loo roll if this thing takes hold and blah blah blah.
It doesn't take into account those who aren't able to.
Exactly, those who don't have those who don't have the means to bulk buy. So it doesn't really reflect very well on anyone. And it does seem to be really odd, the things that people are choosing to bulk buy.
Why
loo
toilet
roll?
paper?
Yeah,
that I don't get at all. Has anyone figured that? Is this one of the great mysteries of this particular?
We spoke to a psychologist in the
Oh, you did? You had a psychologist. I love it. Okay.
Lots of other things.
Okay.
Which you said,
Can you imagine getting the phone call? We want you on Sky News. Oh, great! I've arrived. What do you want to talk about? On toilet paper.
The reason is that people buy toilet paper is because it is. They feel powerless. It's quite a big thing.
Yeah.
So they're able to pick up something. They feel it doing something. It's something comforting. It's something soft. And she said that is the psychology behind it. I think it's just people are worried about not being able to.
Not sure he was
I want wine and biscuits, not lots of loo roll.
herd tactics. This is the inside of the Mail as well, page 11. UK experts reject this criticism of herd tactics. This is about the herd mentality in
Herd
terms
immunity,
of panic buying? No, it's about herd
It's,
immunity. I'm saying
yes.
it's about herd
I think herd immunity, isn't
Yeah.
it? So the idea that the way the chief scientific officer articulated, I felt in the press conference in Downing Street, was that they want to accept some healthy people getting the virus, developing the antibodies. This means that they can't pass it on to the vulnerable people who we now understand are going to be isolated for a few months. So it means that the 60% of the population who need to have gone through the virus in order to create herd immunity are the ones who are going to be least likely to die or become seriously ill. I mean, there are clear problems with this. I mean, if having had the virus, you're still susceptible to it in the future. And also, of course, the number of people in that 60% who may die or need critical care beds. But the scientific logic is debated.
Yeah, and I don't. It's not clear whether the herd immunity thing will work, because, as Matthew says, it's not clear whether people can catch this virus again. But I think what the chief medical officer was making clear was that it's not that they're desperate to get 60% of the population to have it so that we can. We all seem to be talking about herd immunity a lot when it's not actually. He's saying, come on, let's get 60% infected so that we can have herd immunity. He's just saying it's basically inevitable. It's not possible to keep this low. So we may as well be making sure that it's the healthy people that get it, not those in high risk groups. So I think there's a little bit too much focus on this. Exactly, a little bit too much focus on this herd immunity
That's
thing.
a great
I think
point.
that was only a small part of it.
Well, I mean, if they genuinely believe that it's inevitable, that this will spread and become endemic, then yes, you're absolutely right. You want the people who, as it were, confer the herd immunity to be the healthiest people, the ones who are not going to be killed or made seriously ill by it. And I mean, obviously, some people dispute that it needs to become endemic, but yes, I think that may well be.
Yeah.
It's grim stuff. Let's turn away from coronavirus just for our last story. We've only got a minute left. This is inside the Mail as well. A Lancashire pig farmer who could knock out Tyson Fury. How?
You're looking at me and I'm looking at you.
You're a
We were
sports
like,
guy.
we were trying to think of something other than the moment, scrambling through the. What is there? What is it? We thought we'd use this as a departure point to talk about the fact that sport has ground to a halt. And what on earth we're going to do without it?
That was niftily.
Was that good? Was that a good segue?
Segue, the fact that you haven't fully done your homework.
You're quite right. You're
I
quite
think the story
it's
and
not
looked
your
at
fault. I share responsibility. But I'd say this though: what on earth? Sports channel. Sky have got sports channels. What are they going to broadcast? I write for the sports section of the Times. There's no live sport happening. What are we going to do? And that's less significant than the fact that sports disappeared.
And it's a whole industry, such a big money-making industry as well.
Do you watch much? A bit.
No.
Well, I'm forced to by my children just because it's on in the background, but football. But
funnily enough, I think a lot of people who love sport, it's an escapism for them.
we're going to be coming back in a short while. Thank you both very much. Times and Sunday Times columnist Matthew Syed and Olivia Utley, deputy leader writer for The Sun. Thank you both very much for joining us. Let's see what's on the front of some of those front pages. The Mirror says it'll be all about coronavirus for all of them. The Mirror reporting that the government is declaring war on the illness by using 8,000 private hospital beds to relieve pressure on the NHS. The Telegraph also says that the Prime Minister's on a war footing in the fight against COVID-19. The Mail has the government drawing up plans to put troops on the streets to guard hospitals and supermarkets as the outbreak worsens in the UK. Over 70s face stay-at-home order. That's the warning on the front of the Express. The Observer highlights the joint effort of the NHS and private hospitals to fight the crisis. The death toll from COVID-19 is on the front of the Sunday Times. It says it has forced the Prime Minister to act. And on the Daily Star on Sunday, details around Diana Princess of Wales's death have apparently been hidden by French authorities until 2082. So we're joined now by Tom and Olivia, and a coronavirus again on the front of every single paper. The Sunday Times is the one you want to kick off this half hour. The death toll leaping and Johnson forced to act. I mean, it's doubled, hasn't it, today?
Yeah, which was definitely faster than anyone anticipated it would. But I think it's quite interesting. We're hearing a lot. I mean, it's here on the front of the Sunday Times, but it's also a lot on social media. There are a lot of people saying that Boris Johnson has been forced to U-turn. And I think kind of the whole point about the government strategy was we're going to keep every option on the table. Just because we're not doing something now, it doesn't mean that we're ruling out doing it in the future. So I think it's quite dangerous. I mean, if you read this article, it's completely fair enough. But I think it's quite dangerous, people accusing the government of making U-turns, when actually the whole point about this is we've got to be as flexible as possible all the time, and policy has to change to take into account events changing. And I think that's sort of where the conversation should be at, rather than this criticisation.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, it's a very interesting story, this, on the front page of the Sunday Times. It goes through all of the potential plans that the government has about to come into effect, one of which is that if one person in the family has the symptoms, the entire family self-isolates, that older and vulnerable people may be asked to go into isolation for up to 4 months, that the army will be mobilised if necessary. Train companies are looking to cut services, asking the government for permission, and a whole range of other things. And I think it's absolutely right, because this is a threat that is basically unprecedented in our lifetimes, a very scary one. I think a lot of us know more about virology than we did a few months ago. But I think you're absolutely right. This may well, I mean, they all said it was about timing, and it may well be that they now feel this is the right time to bring all of these measures into play. And my hunch is the public will accept it, because I think we really do understand the existential risk.
It seemed that when the story first broke a few weeks ago, we were all worried about holidays and about whether we'd get on money for holidays or whether you should get travel insurance. And it's now morphed into we're going to lose loved members of our family.
Exactly, and it's all just moving so quickly. There's an interesting piece in the Times today, Janice Turner saying that on Wednesday she was, kissing her friend on the cheek and it felt a bit naughty, but, there we go. And then by today, she was standing away from people in yoga classes, and it's all just going so quickly. There's an interesting detail here that apparently there's a poll that shows that the public support food rationing.
They do, that's fascinating.
Really interesting. And similarly in Italy, 89% of the country support the lockdown, which is incredible, really. So the public really are getting on board with
Well, it's on the front of the Times as well, isn't it? On the right-hand side, drop that loo roll and control yourself.
Yes.
And I know a lot of the supermarkets are now putting up signs and saying to people, we have supplies, please don't stockpile, think of other shoppers, think of other people.
I mean, the dynamics are interesting in psychological and behavioural terms. I did my first ever column for the Sunday Times last Sunday and was saying that this is a major threat. And a lot of the responses were, do you realise more people die in car accidents than have died? But what about the flu? Looking at the static number, but it's the exponential rise that I think we're now understanding might be coming down the tracks without countermeasures. It's no good comparing. I mean, car deaths are statistically independent. It's a contagion that can suddenly spike in a way that is non-linear. And I think people are beginning to understand that, which is, I think, why the psychology is changing. You mentioned how it's changing day. Have you noticed how almost day by day you're seeing slight changes in the way people are interacting, what they're talking about, what their fears are?
Absolutely, yeah. I think I read an interesting it was a podcast I was listening to, saying that that one part of the government's not introducing draconian measures might actually be sensible, because instead of feeling like we're all naughty teenagers who've been told to stay at home and we're going to escape and go out and meet our friends anyway because it's human nature to break the rules, instead the government say, well, we encourage you to do this, we encourage you to do that, and people take the responsibility on for themselves. And I think we are seeing quite a lot of that, people making their own decisions, not because the government's forcing them to, but because they think that they should.
The Telegraph's front page, this is about the Prime Minister putting industry, and when talks about industry, is talking about the people who make ventilators on a war footing to equip the NHS, and also the story on the right there about families being told to self-isolate together if one falls ill. And again, on that tone thing, I think, a couple of weeks ago it was all about, I'm going to have to self-isolate, which box sets am I going to watch? And now it's just become a bit more straightforward and serious, hasn't it?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the thing about people cancelling their holidays, when I've got friends who are going to California and they were so worried about the fact they might not be going to California, and then when the ban came down today, they just said, yeah, of course. I mean, it would seem inappropriate to complain about losing a holiday when people are actually losing family members.
The other thing I think that's coming across in the pages today and in the news more generally is this fragmentation in what had been a reasonably solid scientific and political consensus at the beginning of the week, scientists and other politicians are critiquing the government strategy, that they should have been more strenuous countermeasures earlier. And it seems to me there are good arguments on both sides. And there are also alternative arguments that are being aired that also sound credible. The difficulty here, in my view, is the level of uncertainty. Many different variables at play. Whichever strategy you deploy, there will be people who can come up with a different strategy. But I think it's interesting to put one side. I mean, I don't envy anyone having to make decisions of this significance. But had Boris Johnson rejected the scientific advice, I think that would have been a very invidious position for a politician to be in. Accepting it, I think it's also a difficult position to be in because a lot of people are worried about it.
But the difficulty is, of course, that scientists base their conclusions on studying and research, and we just know so little about this. We know we're in such early stages, and we just don't know what the true figures are, do we?
No, exactly. And all of this modelling that we talk about, as Matthew was saying earlier, if one tiny little bit is slightly different, then the whole model is thrown out of sync and it doesn't really work at all. So it all depends on these tiny little things. I think what's so important is that is the communication thing, and I'm not sure if the government has quite managed that right yet. I think if there was a press conference every single day and the Prime Minister explained the modelling, and I'm sure that it is sensible and they're clearly doing their absolute best, but if they just tried to explain to us the models, even if we won't quite understand them, then that might help a little bit. And I think they're beginning to realise this. And now I think the last week's press conference, where he took sort of every single question, flanked by two experts, was really, really good. But I think we need to see a lot more of that. Even if we don't understand it, it would be good to be told.
Well, they are. I agree with that completely. I think they are going to publish the modelling so that the scientific community can look, critique. They might get some useful feedback, who knows. I think that's a sensible thing to do. I think there should be openness in a situation like this, not just for public confidence, but there may be an insight somewhere out there that they may be helped by. But I also totally agree that the press conference, when was it? Was it Thursday? I mean, I watched it live. I'm sure a lot of other people, if they had an opportunity to do so, will have done. I found it quite reassuring, got some answers. I think we do need a daily press conference, better explanations about what's happening.
The danger that if they do that the public starts zoning out. If it seems like that they're timing it so that, the first week's press conference is all about wash your hands, the second week's press, and it sinks in.
You get one message every time, like in government. Yeah, that
and I suppose having a daily press conference might be difficult. I mean, it might be months and months and months. Yeah. So perhaps it does need to be punctuated.
In terms of testing, you've picked the story inside the Mail on Sunday. Trump takes the test and then bans UK travellers. Just announced in the last half an hour that he has tested negative, according to his doctor. Testing, I mean, would you like to see more testing here in the UK?
Well, I suppose it's so difficult to test as many people as we would like to test. I mean, there are just obvious constraints on the NHS. And yes, it would be great to see the figures, but I think now we've got the estimate that probably 10,000 people in the UK already have it. I'm not sure that at this stage testing all the time might not be the most helpful thing to be doing.
But we don't know that people have it. They could.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, it's an extraordinarily difficult balance. One of the other things that struck me, just briefly on Trump, is wearing that USA cap. Of course, that is quite appealing to his demographic, America First policy. There's nothing wrong with being patriotic, I don't think. I think there is a major problem when there are systemic threats that transcend national borders, that you don't have the leader of the free world capable of leading a multilateral, coordinated response.
I think that foreign virus.
Exactly. Yeah. Went down to the lowest common denominator. And the future threats, future mutations, there may be something that has mild early symptoms, high death rate, high transmission rate. Think of that. You definitely need an agreed multilateral approach or it'll wipe out the species. I'll put it this way, he is not the person who is likely to get that consensus.
Exactly, and then you compare it to, I was thinking about the financial crisis and the way Obama and Gordon Brown together led on the response to that, and it was really impressive and drew together the global community, and you just cannot imagine in a million years Boris Johnson and anyone doing that. And I read a piece saying that perhaps it'll be Macron and Boris Johnson who managed to lead this forward and have some kind of global vision for how we're going to get through this and what happens next. next. But it's impossible to imagine Trump being involved in a way that Obama certainly would have been.
Interesting stuff. We've got lots more to come after this break, including away from coronavirus, one late for work reason that you might hesitate to tell your boss. We'll chat about that next. Go to the now, the Times and Sunday Times columnist Matthew Syed and Olivia Utley, deputy leader writer for The Sun. Slightly moving away from coronavirus, which is quite nice in a way because it has dominated the news for so long, it feels. The top of the Sunday Times, you wanted to pick out this thing with Wayne Rooney and his new column and this photo. It's very hipster, isn't it?
It's a really, it is, I think, a really striking photo. I have actually read the column. It's a great column. But we were talking a bit. A lot of us are probably going to have to isolate at some point, and the question is, what will we do? Now, one of the things...
Is he writing this column himself? I mean, you obviously know if you're...
I don't know, actually. I don't know. I think it might... Yeah, he might be. Or it might be. But what are we going to do? Yeah, that's harsh.
Sorry.
I'm not writing, I promise. But what will we do? What will you do? I mean, I find sport as an escapism, even though I'm a full-time sports journalist. You know, being able to go and watch a football game or the Masters golf, it's a way of switching off. It's a way of an antidote to the seriousness of life. But it's disappeared. I could write another book. Thank you. You enjoyed one of them. Oh, I could read it. What will you do if you had to self-isolate for a month? What would be the thing that you would look for?
I've got a really long list. Gardening. I'm learning to sew. Decorating the house. I would sort out my wedding album from 13 years ago. I've never got round to getting sorted. I've got a massive list. What do you do?
I really need a list. I haven't really thought about it. I only thought as far as like...
Well, a lot of people have got that box sets and other things of that kind. It's an opportunity to do some interesting things. But I tell you what, I think people who are really into sport are gonna... Look, it puts sport in perspective. Something as serious as this, you know, when there's a real risk and there's a huge amount of anxiety. But I do think, as the weeks turn into months, Premier League's been suspended till April the 3rd. I think it's highly likely that it will be knocked on. You know, I think people will really miss it, and it will be something that I think people will realise just how important sport can be as part of a balance.
Because it's not just watching it at home; it's those who participate and what they get as a group, doing something together as a group, and not just sport.
Well, exactly.
Across a lot of different things over the next few months, people are not going to be congregating.
And each individually, it's quite easy to say, oh, sport's not that important, or like, I don't know, fashion shows aren't that important or whatever, but altogether, there's just sort of the fabric of life and watching it all come down.
And it is interesting. I mean, we are social animals, aren't we, to a large extent? And one of the quite heartening things that came out, at least one of the stories I saw in Italy, is that people were self-isolating, but they were still managing to sing out of the window and communicate, and there was still a sense of community and solidarity. And, you know, I don't want to overdo it, but I think we live in a culture, perhaps more now than 50 years ago, of individualism. And there may be some aspect of this that brings us closer together. I mean, people have talked a lot about the Blitz spirit.
People are being much friendlier, I keep noticing. I mean, I've had 2 people on the tube now offering me hand sanitizer. Is that friendly, or do I just look dirty? But suddenly thought,
you need it. But funnily enough, when the football was still, I took my son, he's 6 years old, I took him to Stamford Bridge last Sunday. So football was still going on. We did talk about whether it was a good thing to do. And as we came out of Fulham Broadway Tube, one of the police officers, because he was with a young boy, and gave me hand sanitizer, got him rubber, and started. And there was something really quite... touching is the wrong word, it's more than that. There was something really uplifting about that.
Okay.
I want to hear about, why have you taken you 30 years to do the wedding album?
13.
13?
I'm not that old. Goodness gracious.
You got married in very...
I got married when I was 3. Right, Mail on Sunday, inside pages, moving swiftly on. Now, this is about bad hair days. Apparently, it's making thousands of people late for work.
This doesn't affect me. I
I was just saying,
choose-
pick a story about
I
you.
really sympathise with that. I think it's quite unfair. There are so many ways that women can look unprofessional. And like, it's not just that you want your hair to look lovely, but if it's a sort of bird's nest and you come into work, you do look a bit sort of scrappy and you're not really taking that seriously. And it's the same, I read a good column, I think it was in the Sunday Times, about how men always get the option of just wearing the uniform of a navy blue suit. And
Or a
women never
cap
get
like
that
Donald
option.
Trump.
Yeah, exactly. So I think women should have
I'm slightly alarmed. I mean, obviously, my boss won't be watching, but I've never been late for work because of a dodgy hairdo. But it does say that the women from Newcastle in the northeast, me, most likely to be late because of styling issues. 70% say they will be late
I like that.
once a month. Yeah, no, it is. Yeah, my sympathies. We all have bad hair days,
Yeah.
apart from Matthew.
You know what I mean? When I started losing my hair, I was gutted, but there is one upside.
Yeah,
I
there
have
you
to think
go.
about it.
Well, thank you both very much. It's great to get your choices this evening. Thank you.